Hi. So it's occurred to me over the last 5 or so years that I could be a lot more active in my reading, both in reading a little bit more and actually thinking about what I'm reading because I don't think about it. So I thought starting this channel would be a good way to keep me in check for both reading more and then reflecting on said reading. So yeah, I hope you enjoy me rambling about random books, what I've read. Roll intro. So the first book I'm looking at is The Nosferatu Scroll by James Becker, which is basically Dan Brown but with vampires. Overall, it's an okay book, which is surprising considering I wouldn't rate the prose or the characters or the plot particularly highly, but altogether it all just made an okay book rather than a bad book. Here's why. So the basics of the plot are this. Chris Bronson, an English detective, goes holidaying in Venice with his ex-wife, Angela Lewis, for the Day of the Dead, which is not apparently just a Mexican thing. Unfortunately, there is a cult of vampire people running around murdering young ladies, and Angela gets kidnapped, so Chris has to save her before she gets murdered too. That is basically what happens. That is about as much as the blurbs as I think. First of all, the good things, because there were a few good things. 3 good things. Firstly, I thought the prologue was actually very well put together. Most people don't like prologues. I've heard a lot of people say they really hate prologue, think they're pointless, but it was quite good in this because it really did set up a certain atmosphere, which I'd hoped would carry through, but it didn't. It was very mysterious. A lot of details were kept in the shadows, so we weren't quite sure what was going on, but there was enough information that it didn't matter. The prologue is in Bohemia in the 1700s, I believe, and it's about the funeral of Princess Eleonora Amalia, who was a real historical figure, who, I don't think it's a spoiler to say, was believed to be a vampire because the book's called the Nosferatu Scroll, so she was a vampire. Oh. They tried to keep that mysterious because they don't actually say that, but it's pretty obvious. That's my only qualm with the prologue. It tries to be mysterious, it's not really, but it gave it a good go and I appreciated that. I also really liked the amount of research James Becker had done when he was writing this. There's a lot of little tidbits about the way vampires were buried in Europe, the history of Halloween, the Day of the Dead, stuff like that I thought was a nice touch. And I think he did come up with some quite interesting vampire lore that did seem original. I've never heard some of these ideas before in vampire books. It did undermine itself a little bit, but I'll get onto that later. But it was nice to have a fresh take on vampires that wasn't the sort of love interest in a really bad fantasy romance. That's all the good things I can think of for now. So, what didn't I like so much? Firstly, the prose was irritating to read. It wasn't irritating, it was pretty dull though. So Becker has the same problem as Dan Brown in that he over-explains every single detail in excruciating detail. That was a really good sentence. Sure. I'm going to keep that in anyway. This is how I talk. So yeah, that's just annoying. It needed a lot of trimming to cut all the nonsense out that didn't need to be there. Don't treat your reader like an idiot. It's quite insulting. The dialogue was not human speech. Angela, the ex-wife, is the worst example of this because she constantly goes on lectures about random things and sounds like she's swallowed a textbook. Except not quite as endearing as like Hermione Granger, just irritating. The descriptions were quite lackluster, which is a shame because it's set in Venice, and Venice is such a beautiful city, and they didn't describe it very well. I mean, they were fine, but just not very interesting. And I like interesting descriptions, so I was just quite disappointed. And action. He can't write action. Again, probably because it's over-explained every single action, with every single reaction to that action, which doesn't make for very good action. And unfortunately, the author seems to rely on boring action to resolve all the things. So, yeah, prose not great, but inoffensive enough to read quickly, so I can't fault it that much, I guess. Secondly, the characters were pretty dull. They were quite boring. None of them had any real personality to them. I mean, Chris Bronson had the personality of detective guy who seems to just butt his head in where it doesn't belong. Angela had the personality of knowing all the things that were relevant to the plot because she works in a museum and that makes her smart in all the things. There was a character called Marietta whose entire purpose was to be kidnapped by the bad guys early on, and so her personality is just not having a good time in a jail cell and also likes ice cream. That was another important character thing about her. There was Inspector Bianchi, who was the Italian police guy. He was just grumpy because he's the police guy who's getting in the hero's way all the time. And there was Marco, who was an evil guy, except he didn't seem that evil. He actually seemed quite nice and had quite a nice rapport with Angela when he kidnapped her. So he was the most interesting character, ironically enough. There's also the head of the vampire cult, who's another character worth mentioning, whose main personality is he smells really bad, because apparently that's the only thing the author wanted to say about him. I can't remember what he looked like. In my head, I'm imagining the Nosferatu from the film Nosferatu, but with cartoon stink lines and flies. That's what he looks like in my head. So yeah, characters weren't very interesting. The other thing I could think of is the fact that the book was very, very repetitive. It really slowed down in the middle. They went to the same graveyard about 3 times, and it's not a very interesting setting, so it's like, stop going to the graveyard. I'm sick of the graveyard. Go somewhere else. Which again is a shame because, it's Venice, it's beautiful, there's tons of islands and really cool places to go, and they never went to any of them. So yeah, those were the main problems I can talk about without going into specifics about the plot, which I will, because there were problems there too, and they upset me a lot more than they probably should have. Here be spoilers. So, the plot goes thus. I should backtrack a little bit to the opening, the first chapter, not the opening, where Chris and Angela go to a graveyard on the Day of the Dead in Venice, because a grave gets broken into. The graves aren't like headstones in the ground, they're more like stone tombs above the ground, so, when they get broken into, the skeletons there on display. Someone gets broken into. It's the tomb of a young Italian woman called Carmelita, and Angela nicks a diary from the grave, which is a bit rude, but, apparently no one else to be interested in it, so it's fine, I guess. The diary's written in Latin, because apparently oldie worldy nobles liked writing in Latin, because they're all pretentious. So Angela starts translating the diary for funsies, and then, she gets kidnapped, all that stuff, and Angela is forced to continue translating the diary for the evil guys. The evil guys are after the source, which is the titular scroll, even though it's never called that in the book, so I don't really know why the book was called that, but, never mind. Because the scroll contains really important information for the vampires. You see, the cult are not actually vampires, they're just men who want to be vampires really, really badly. Although the head of the cult is implied to be a real vampire, maybe? So I don't really know. I don't think vampirism passes through biting people in this, so I guess they couldn't just ask him to bite them all. Probably a good thing, because... So, while she's translating the diary to find the scroll, Chris is looking for her. Marietta doesn't really do anything apart from be sad. And she's also a way for the reader to see what horrible things a cult are doing. Which is quite... It's not graphically written, but it's pretty horrible. I don't really want to go into detail with it because it's nasty. But let's just say it contains very violent assault of women in an intimate way. I think that's the most delicate way I can put it. In Italy, young women's bodies are being found, who were the victims of the cult. They've all got like animal bite marks to the neck, and they're all bled out, and also they all have milk in their stomachs, but it's not human milk, and it's not cow milk, and it's not goat milk, so I've called it mystery milk, because I don't know what it is. So Angela translates the diary. They find the scroll on this island called Poveglia, which is a real place, and actually quite horrendous. I'd look it up if you want, it's quite interesting. And the scroll contains 2 bits of really vital information for the vampires. One is the full ritual to turn people into vampires, and the second thing that they want is a family tree of the descendants of Princess Eleonora, who was the woman in the prologue who was buried. I think these are stupid things to be looking for, personally. I'll get into that later. They want the family tree to find out if some bloke in the graveyard is a direct descendant of her, so that they can use his skull in the ritual. So I don't quite know why they needed the ritual when they already had most of the ritual. It's quite specific. I keep saying ritual, that sounds like a word anymore. The ritual is the assault of this woman who has to have started her periods but not have had a baby, and they also need the ground up skull of someone who was a direct descendant of a vampire, and also the woman has to be a direct descendant of a vampire line. So they wanted to make sure that this guy in the graveyard whose skull they had nicked was descended from Princess Eleonora, who was meant to be a certified vampire, which seemed weird because they'd clearly been able to work out modern people who were vampires. I don't know why they couldn't work out the descendant of this famous historical figure, if he was related to her or not, so I was a bit stupid anyway. So they find out through the scroll that they were missing one key ingredient for the recipe, and that was a second woman to assault and make her bleed out to death. But this second woman needed to not be related to a vampire, and Angela is not related to vampires, so that was lucky. So you get to the finale. Lots of other stuff happens, but it's not very important. Angela and Marietta are in the cellar going to be murdered in this horrible ritual. Chris follows some guys to the island they're on. He phones Inspector Bianchi, the police officer, for backup, but he finds that Inspector Bianchi is one of the cult people. Oh no! How, unpredictable. So he incapacitates one of the cult members, and he steals his robe and his hood, and he sneaks in to watch. But then when Marietta is taken out to be murderized, he reveals himself to stop them, and then the Italian SWAT team barge in, because of course they do, because it turns out Bianchi was actually good all along, and he was just trying to take down the vampires from the inside. So it all goes a bit mad, people are shooting, and the lights all go out, and then the head vampire cult guy escapes through a secret door with Angela, and he escapes to a speedboat, because we'd already had a speedboat chase when Chris was trying to not die at one point, but we needed a second one because clearly James Becker is very good at writing them. Chris follows. They chase on the speedboats. He saves Angela, but the head vampire speedboat disappears beneath the waves, and his body is never found, so he must have washed out into the Adriatic Sea? My geography isn't very good. Then they have croissants for breakfast the next morning. And Bianchi explains all the stuff that James didn't fit in, like the milk was actually wolf milk, which the vampires added to their ritual for no reason other than they thought maybe it would help. Then there's an epilogue where a family smells something disgusting in the house next door's cellar, and they think there's a fox dying in there or something, and the smell gets stronger for a few days, and then one day it vanishes. The vampire dude must still be alive and actually a vampire. Oh well, we'll never look on that again because I don't think there's a direct sequel to this. So that's basically what happens. Yeah. So I had two main issues with the sort of plot / spoilery stuff. And those things were, A, the ending. The finale just fell flat to me. Both because the setting was actually quite boring. Compared to, the rest of the book. We had this graveyard that was kind of dull because we weren't there so often, but it was cool the first time. Pavalia, where the scroll was hidden, was a really cool idea. Well, it's a real place, but it was a cool place to set it because it has some fascinating, very dark history attached. And then, the prologue had the little chapel in the middle of Bohemia, which was spooky. And then here it's just some grotty old cellar on some random island. And I just sort of wished the author had done something more with it. Made up an island with some more cool history, or given a reason for the vampires to be based there, and maybe, Chris Bronson might have actually done some detective work to work out that's where they were, rather than just follow guys in a speedboat. And the fight itself was just pretty boring, really. I mean, James Becker isn't very good at writing action scenes, which is a problem when you try and end it with the action scenes, with the SWAT team and then the chasing and the vampire ripping someone's throat out, I think. And then the speedboats, and I'd had enough of speedboats at that point. So I just sort of wanted the ending to be a little bit more intellectual. I was sort of hoping maybe Angela would come across some information when she was translating the diary or the scroll and found out some key information for how to take down vampires. They could have used that. But they didn't. So that was just disappointing. My other issue is with the scroll, and I did sort of touch on this earlier, but I'll lay it down a little bit more specifically why the scroll annoyed me. Because the scroll is built up quite a lot. I mean, it's the title of the book. It's the thing that everyone wants. There's clues as to where it's hidden. It's meant to be the key to the vampires to do the thing. And then it just seemed kind of pointless. I mean, the two bits of information they wanted was the family tree to confirm, I think his name was Diluca, as being descended from Eleonora, and they wanted to know the ritual to turn people into vampires. The problems being that, A, they already had most of the ritual. Literally the only thing they didn't have was a second woman. So I just don't know how they managed to get all of that stuff right and then miss this really big thing. And if the main vampire guy was a vampire, then did he remember the ritual and he was the one that told them about it? In which case, did he forget assaulting a second woman? Or did they find it written somewhere else? In which case, how come they didn't have that bit? Like, they could have explained it, like, oh, we used this old source, but it was incomplete. But I don't think they said that at all. So it just seemed like a really stupid thing for them to not have when they had all these other really specific stuff, like the woman has to have had periods but not have had a baby, and the ground up skull of, a vampire bloodline person. It seemed like quite a weak reason. And the second thing, the family tree, was also pretty stupid, because they've been looking up family trees all over Italy to find women to kidnap, because they need to be directly descended from a vampire line. So I don't understand how they weren't able to work out that Diluca was descended from Eleonora, when that should be easier, because Eleonora was a famous historical figure. I mean, she's not like Henry VIII famous, but she's famous enough to have her own Wikipedia page. And using Wikipedia, in about an hour, I actually managed to make a family tree of her descendants to, I think, her grandchildren, a few great-grandchildren, and I got bored and gave up. So they could have worked that out on the internet, in less than an hour. So I don't quite know why they needed to get this scroll to confirm it. That was stupid. So I just got annoyed that all this time was spent looking for this scroll when it didn't really offer any information that they couldn't have gotten from somewhere else, which made it disappointing. Oh yeah, another thing was the vampire lore was a little bit inconsistent. So they were kind of both wanted to imply that vampires maybe were real, but then also wanted to explain how they could not be real. So one of the things I said was that, a vampire is immortal, but not in a physical way, because when a host body dies, the vampire soul will move to another body. And Angela was like, oh gee, that must be how the idea of vampires being immortal came about, because they jump to another body. So I was like, oh, so vampires aren't real, they just think they are. But then the vampire cult did seem to be a real vampire. So what was the point of giving an explanation how vampires weren't real and say, oh, they are real, and also their bodies are cut immortal because he managed to survive not drowning if he was alive at the end, and that's what that weird smell in the cellar was. So that was a bit annoying, because that was quite a cool bit of vampire lore, but whatever. If this book landed on my lap in a workshop setting, what I would tell the author is how to make it less bad. Obvious things is just trimming fat off the prose, slim it down, get rid of the stuff you don't need. You get a red pen and cross out the sentences and the lines that aren't required, they're all redundant. Read the dialogue out loud. Like, dialogue is so easy to fix. Usually, you just get someone to read it out to you, and you can hear whether or not it sounds like human language. No one read this out loud when he was writing it, I can tell. Let me just look at my quick thing. I would have given the scroll a different purpose. I probably would have either had like an incantation in some non-human language that maybe would be more believable to have been forgotten by the head vamp if that was where they got the ritual from, or just wasn't written down anywhere else. Or maybe like a physical requirement, like a vial of vampire blood or a magic knife, or just something they couldn't get from the internet, because that was annoying. And it would have been more interesting, more exciting. I think I said that I would have had Angela have some information to defeat the vampire rather than an action scene, because that was pretty lame. Given the characters more like character scenes and more personality traits. You don't need to have really big scenes, even just little asides about things they like doing or hobbies that aren't, stealing diaries and eating ice cream and stuff like that. It's not really character stuff. And honestly, I think the biggest structural thing I would have done is actually cut out all the mentions of vampires till about the last third. You see, there's nothing much to engage the reader in this. For a conspiracy thriller book, we're not allowed to work anything out, because we're not given information to work the things out. As soon as Angela translates the diary, she pretty much tells us what it means, or another character tells us what it means. So we're not allowed to work it out. We're not allowed to be part of the mystery. So I think what I would have done is had the vampires be the mystery. But you can keep the prologue, and that would have made more sense to be mysterious, because we don't know why she's being buried in this weird way and having, her heart gets cut out. We don't say heart, but he's implying heart. And why, all the attendants have to be murdered afterwards, and why she's being buried under several feet of stone and stuff. That's all mysterious, and we'd be wondering why she's doing that, why she's being buried this way. And if it wasn't called Nosferatu Scroll, we might actually be wondering that, rather than being like, oh, she's a vampire. And then instead of Angela saying, oh yeah, vampires were buried with bricks in their mouths and their head cut off, that's why this person's been buried like that, just describe the fact that her head's been removed to her feet and there's a brick in her mouth, and people be going, oh, that's weird, why's she been buried like that? Give us the little clues. Then we can go, oh, I wonder if it's something to do with, like vampires or something, and then when it is vampires, we kind of go, I worked that out, I'm so clever. To give us something to do, please. It was kind of a boring read, which is not what you want from a conspiracy book. It shouldn't be boring, and it was, because we were not allowed to actively engage with it, which is the worst crime of all. So yeah, I don't think I have anything more to say other than that. I mean, yeah, it was an okay book. It's fine as something to fill the time. You don't have to think too hard. But I wouldn't call it edifying literature. I mean, I guess if you like things like Dan Brown's books or like Indiana Jones-esque stuff, you'd probably enjoy it. I think if you're not a big reader as well, you probably enjoy it more than I did, because the writing style might actually be quite useful because you're not forcing yourself to think too hard about it, and it's a little bit easier to read more casually. If you like vampires, like folkloric thriller, horror, creature vampires, then you might find some enjoyment out of just the lore that James Becker's put together in this. But you might not. So I'd leave that up to you, I think. And that's all I have to say. Thanks for watching, I guess.